But let's go to the media again. Why is beef getting the blunt of the blow here? Obviously, we're not eating as much red meat as we were a century ago. We're not eating as much beef, but yet that seems to be the protein source and animal that's really getting hitting in the media. So why is it beef and not pork or chicken?
Yeah, it's interesting. I talk about it in the book and kind of dissect it, and I give my own ideas. And obviously, it's just my own ideas. There may be, other equally valid theories on it. But I think a few things. One is that beef was kind of historically in the United States was kind of the most, and in many parts of the world, really, it was kind of one of the most luxurious meats. It was the thing that people kind of coveted for a Sunday dinner. And you didn't eat beef every day, but you ate it as when you could and as a special occasion. And in fact, classic Christmas dinner for a lot of people is some kind of beef roast and so forth. And that's a reflection of the fact that beef has always been kind of precious. And but at the same time, because we have had a lot of cattle in North America, beef became the number one most consumed meat in the United States. And that's true in a few other parts of the world, but not very many. So I think it both by the fact that it was kind of in a way, a special thing, and in another way, a very ubiquitous thing. It made it kind of a target. Like, it's always the most interesting thing to knock down, the sitting king, and there's that old phrase, that beef is king. And, I really think because beef was king. I mean, chicken is actually now the most consumed meat in the United States. So it's not beef anymore, but it was for decades beef. And, so I think that made it really attractive to attack it. But the other thing too, I think, is that they're so visible on the landscape. All of the, even when chickens were raised in a different way, they would just kind of be, near the barnyard in their little flocks or whatever. You wouldn't be driving through a landscape and see a bunch of chickens on the hills, the way you do with cattle. They're large, they're visible. Beef cattle especially are outside. So a lot of, people living in the United States today have rarely seen any farm animals except cattle. That's kind of it. And they've only seen it when they're driving through spaces that have them. So there's something about that makes it more something that's in people's minds, and you can kind of get people's attention by talking about it. And the irony of all of that is that actually it's the fact that they live off of grass, they live off of forages, they can survive on that essentially low quality cellulosic vegetation that humans cannot eat directly, and really very few animals can, in fact. And so that's what makes them so special and so valuable in the food system. But it's also, I think, part of the reason that they've been attacked. So, in like one book that I read years ago, Beyond Beef, is the type of example of that, where he just basically says, Jeremy Rifkin, who's a journalist and who's also married to a vegan. I think he may be a vegan himself now too, but he's written on a lot of topics, not just food or agriculture or meat at all. But he, I think, kind of focused in on this for a little while because of the fact that he, had this personal connection to someone who was a vegan. And he basically says that every bad thing that's ever happened on the globe is due to cattle. you know, so that's kind of where, the thinking was, for a while. But I think the good news is there's been, I'd say in the last few years, just, quite recently, a pretty good slew of mainstream articles, movies, documentaries, where they pick up this idea that Alan Savory and others have really pushed forward into the mainstream. In fact, thank God for his TED Talk, which has been seen like 5 million times or something. But it just flips the whole narrative and says, not only are cattle not bad, they're essential, because you have to have these grazing animals. And he especially says cattle because he's fine with sheep and goats as well, but he says cattle are really important because due to their size, that's actually a plus from an environmental standpoint, which is, again, an interesting reversal of what we've all heard for so many years, which is that cattle, because they're big animals, are the worst, on the landscape. But really, what he says is all of these forms of animal impact that the grazing animals have by pressing seeds and vegetation into the soils, by by grazing with their mouths, and by doing that, triggering the growth of the plant, and also triggering more biodiversity within both the soils and in the vegetative life that's there. And of course, through their, their digestive tracts, the urine and the manure coming back onto the soil and fertilizing, and not just with the nitrogen and the phosphorus and the potassium, but also because of all the beneficial bacteria that are contained in their guts, repeatedly coming down onto the land, and that helping to trigger the soil biology and the whole ecological system that they're in. So he says cattle are really important because they're the biggest of these domesticated grazing animals that, I mean, there's a few other large domesticated grazing animals, but we don't have that many bison and then people raising for food and so forth. But so cattle are super important because they do more of that stuff. They have more of that impact. And he believes, and I believe as well, that that's triggering sort of the ecological health of the whole system, that you have kind of, I like to think of it as kind of an upward cascade of benefits that come from that impact. So it's very ironic that the beef cattle animal has been so vilified. And I just kind of flip that whole thing on its head and say, not only is it not bad, but it's essential.